Due to some questions on last week's sermon, remember that was over Mark 14, 27 through 32, that some of you had, you were puzzled by the use of the words, Jesus doubted. So let's quickly clarify as we move this into our lesson of today. John the Baptist doubted, and that is why he sent his disciples to question Jesus. Nowhere in the Gospels does it say that Jesus ever doubted. It says in Mark 14:34, and he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch. Matthew records in 26:39, and he, Jesus, went a little beyond them and fell on his face, praying, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Luke records the same thing, plus Luke adds the following in 22 verses 43 through 44. Now an angel from heaven appeared to Jesus, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood and were falling upon the ground. So the question we have is, why was Jesus in such agony, and why did he pray, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me? I can give you 3 reasons, if you'll follow along. 1, Jesus, being fully God, knows what is going to happen exactly. We see this when he tells Peter exactly what he's going to say, how often he's going to say it, and when he's going to say it. He knows every single person that he loves here on this earth is either going to betray him, deny him, or run away from him. Imagine yourselves how you would feel if every single member of your family, all your friends, and even associates physically left you and then denied they even knew who you were. Reason number 2, Jesus had seen crucifixions, and he knew how Romans questioned people through scourgings, beatings, and torture. Jesus knew that he was going to go through this, and as a human, it was going to be a truly horrific experience. As a human, he would not want to go through this any more than one of us. And number 3, which was absolutely the worst of all, Jesus knew for the first time in eternity that he was going to be separated from God the Father. He knew that he, Jesus, was going to take all the sins of all of humanity from the past, the present, and in the future upon himself. The Bible even tells us he became sin, and that God the Father, being holy, cannot look upon sin. So God was going to turn his back on Jesus, and Jesus knew this. This more than anything Jesus did not want to face, and that is why he was in such agony. In spite of all we've heard, Jesus bowed his will to God the Father because Jesus loves the Father and he loves us. Now, I do something that I think you all should do, and that is harmonize the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell the same story, but they see it through their own eyes. Everything they say is true, and everything they see is true, but what one person sees is not the same as another person. For example, if I were to step forward, trip over this microphone, this box speaker, and fall to the floor, everybody here, if I picked them, they asked what happened, you'd have a different way of seeing exactly what happened. Somebody stuck their head in from out and back and looked, they would have seen a different perspective. And so what you're seeing is each one of the authors of these Gospels is seeing it through a different eye, and they're also presenting it to different people. Like Luke was presenting it mainly to the Gentiles, so he wanted them to be able to understand what was being said through their perspective. So what I want to do then is I have taken Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I have harmonized those Gospels. So everything I'm going to read to you is not anything of my words put in there, but is going to be taken in a chronological order as it happened by using all 4 of these men that wrote the Gospels. Now we're going to drop back, so we got some into last week's lesson from Kip. On verse 42, they were in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus just said, arise, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. That's from last week. So this week, we're going to start in the Harmonized Gospels. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went away with his disciples across the ravine of the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he entered with his disciples. That's the Garden of Gethsemane. Now Judas, who was betraying him, also knew of this place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having obtained the Roman cohort, this are my words here, that's a tenth of a legion, that's 600 men, okay? And the officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, and came there with a crowd with swords, clubs, lanterns, torches, weapons, pitchforks, and donkey. No, donkey and the pitchforks weren't there. Who were from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. So we don't know how many people came in this crowd, but we do know there were 600 Roman soldiers plus their officers, plus there was a big crowd. Now, crowd's not 3. So I'm speculating, this is my words, I'm speculating there's probably 1,000 people or more that are coming. Now, Judas, who was betraying Jesus, had given them a signal saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one, arrest him and lead him away under guard. The one called Jesus, one of the 12, was preceding this crowd and the Romans, and he approached Jesus to kiss him and said, Hail, Rabbi. And Jesus said, Friend, do what you have come for. Judas then kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that were coming upon him, came out into the open and said to them, and remember, he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. You have this huge crowd out there, and so now he's coming out to where the crowd's at. And he said, Whom are you seeking? They answered him, Jesus the Nazarene. And he said to them, I am he. Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them at this time. Now then, when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and they fell to the ground. Now, these Roman soldiers aren't afraid of anything, yet these people were terrified of Jesus. And he then asked them again, Whom are you seeking? And they said, Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus answered and said, I told you that I am he. So if you are seeking me, let these men go their way. Now, he's talking about the disciples that were with him. And this took place so the word which he had spoken would be fulfilled. Of those whom you have given me, I lost not one. That's John 6:39. And Jesus said to them, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a man inciting a riot? Every day I was with you in the temple grounds, teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has taken place so that the scriptures would be fulfilled. Now, which scriptures are those? Well, the first one was Zechariah 11:12 through 17. Here's what Zechariah said. And I said to them, If it is good in your sight, give me my wages. But if not, never mind. So they weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages. Then the Lord said to me, Throw it to the potter, that magnificent price at which I was valued by them. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and threw them to the potter in the house of the Lord. You guys remember, if you know the Bible or what you're going to hear in the next couple lessons, that that's what Judas did. He was paid a measly 30 shekels of silver, and then he felt remorse and he threw it into the temple. And it was because it was blood money. They went and bought the potter's field. The second scripture that was fulfilled was Psalms 41:9. Even my closest friend in whom I trusted, we're talking about Judas, who ate my bread has lifted up his heel against me. Now continuing on in the Harmonized Gospels. Then Simon Peter, since he had a sword, he drew it. And he struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. And that slave's name was Malchus. But Jesus responded and said, Stop, no more of this. And he touched the slave's ear and he healed him. So Jesus said to Peter, he said, Put the sword in its sheath. For all of those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? That's 12,000 angels. And remember, 2 angels destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and all the cities around it, so imagine what 12,000 angels could do, right? The cup which the Father has given me, am I not to drink it? How then would the scriptures of the prophets be fulfilled, which say this must happen this way? Then the Roman cohort, the commander and the officers of the Jews, arrested Jesus. They bound him, and all of his disciples left and fled. a young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet. Kind of an interesting detail, huh? Over his naked body. Now remember, nakedness was extreme shame back in those days. Nobody wanted to be seen naked. And they seized him. But he pulled free the linen sheet, escaped naked. So the Roman cohort, the commander and the officers of the Jews, brought Jesus to Ananias first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest at that time. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was best, in their best interest, for one man to die on behalf of all the people. Caiaphas didn't realize it, but being as high priest, he was prophesying the very thing about Jesus, that Jesus, one man, is to die for all of us. The high priest, Ananias. Now this is where it gets tricky if you're not following along in the harmonized Gospels. They're referring to the high priest, but they took him to Ananias. Now Ananias was not the high priest, but Ananias had been the high priest from 6 AD through 15 AD, and he was still referred to the high priest, even though his son-in-law, Caiaphas, at this time was the actual high priest. Kind of like we refer to Trump and Carter and stuff as President Trump and President Carter, even though they're no longer the presidents, they're past presidents. It's because it's like an honorarium on here. So this will make more sense as I follow along. So the high priest that was then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered him and said, I've spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and the temple area, where all the Jews congregate, and I said nothing in secret. So why are you asking me? Ask those who heard what I spoke to them. Look, these people know what I said. But when he said this, one of the officers who was standing next to Jesus struck Jesus and said, is that any way you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered and said, if I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong I have spoken, but if rightly, why do you strike me? So Ananias, now here's where the confusion came in for a lot of people. He's at the high priest, right? But it said, so Ananias sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So they were referring to Ananias with his honorarium as the past high priest. And now he's going to Caiaphas, the actual high priest. Those who arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And he came inside and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the entire council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so they might put him to death. They were not finding any, even though many false witnesses came forward. For many people were giving false testimony against him, so their testimonies were not consistent and they were conflicting. But later on, two came forward and said, this man stated, I'm able to destroy the temple of God that was made with hands and rebuild it in 3 days with no hands. The high priest then stood up and said to him, now this is Caiaphas, and said, do you offer no answer for what these men are testifying against you? But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, I place you under oath by the living God to tell us whether you're the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One. And Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself, I am. Now that's very important in Jewish language, because when God spoke to Moses and said, who shall I tell that's sending me? He said, I am. So for Jesus to say I am was his declaration that he was in fact God, straight to their face. And so he said, you have said it yourself, I am. But I tell you, from now on, you'll see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming from the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? See, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered, he deserved death. Then they blindfolded him, they spit in his face, and they beat him with fists. And others slapped him. And they said, prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you? I think it gives us a better perspective exactly what happened. Now, I want to tell you a little story here. A very wealthy man with a terminal illness literally wanted to die with all of his money. He knew he was dying and he was going to go quickly. So he turned everything he had into cash. He trusted 1/3 of his money to his pastor, 1/3 of his money to his doctor and 1/3 to his attorney, for them to put into his coffin before they buried him. Now, after his death at the man's funeral, the pastor went up to the coffin, he leaned over, and he whispered to the dead body, and he put a bag into the coffin. The doctor also walked up to the open coffin. He bent over, he whispered something, and he put a bag in the coffin. Then the lawyer went, dropped off a bag, and moved on. As they were carpooling back from the funeral, the lawyer asked the pastor, "What did he whisper?" The pastor, with tears in his eyes, said he had to confess that he spent some of the money on an orphanage so that some hungry kids would not starve and the doors would not be closed. And he feels bad for what he's done, but he said, "I had no other choice." The doctor then admitted that he too had let the dead man know that one of his patients needed a surgery that he himself was not able to do alone, and the man had no money, so he used some of the money to hire another surgeon to help him, and they saved the person's life. The lawyer looked at them with scorn and said, "How could you? You have betrayed a man's last and dying request." The doctor and the pastor looked at the lawyer and said, "So, your bag had all the money he entrusted you with?" To which he replied, "Absolutely right. I wrote him a check for the full amount, not 1 penny less." So the question is, was that man betrayed? Have you ever felt betrayed? Has your spouse ever betrayed you? Has a friend ever betrayed you? A work associate ever betrayed you? Has even your dog ever betrayed you? Remember how you felt? Imagine how you would have felt if one of your closest companions, whom you spent almost every waking hour for the last 3 years, betrayed you for mere money. And that wasn't a lot of money either. Imagine then how you would have felt if that betrayal, after that happened, every single member of your family, your friends, just totally abandoned you and denied they even knew who you were. We just read the harmonized gospel of Jesus' betrayal and where Jesus was betrayed by the one who had been with him for 3 years. And everyone who professed to love him fled. If you remember back to last week's message that Kip told us in verse 31, but Peter kept saying insistently, "Even if I have to die, I'll die with you. I will not deny you." And all the rest of the disciples were saying the same thing, and look, we just saw what happened, right? How do you think Jesus felt being totally human at that dark hour? The question I have to ask you guys today is, have we ever betrayed Jesus? Well, how can we, you ask? Jesus isn't here anymore. But what about those of us who are Christians? Can we betray him? Do we betray him every day when we swear? Well, I don't swear from the public's around, David, you tell me. What about your kids? Do they hear you swear when you're working in the garage or the barn or the kitchen? What message are you telling them? I used to have a potty mouth. I swore like a sailor. Maybe the fact that I was a sailor had something to do with it, but what was my testimony like when I swore? I no longer swear, thanks be to God. Do we betray Jesus when we badmouth our spouses around our friends? God gave you your spouse. And our relationship between husband and wife is supposed to be like that between Jesus and the church. Would you be proud to have Jesus sitting there next to you when you're bad-mouthing your spouse among friends or even strangers? Do we betray Jesus when we treat our spouses, children, brothers, sisters, parents, in-laws with mean, hurtful, or spiteful language? But David, you say, they treat me worse, or they started it. Does that matter? Does Jesus care? Do we betray Jesus when we take unfair advantage of others? The Bible tells us that Satan goes around like a roaring lion seeking whom he can devour, but sometimes he does it sneakily. Lately, he's been trying to hammer me and my wife. Last week, I went down to Caldwell and I stopped by Tacoma Screw with my wife and bought 200 special screws for a project that I was doing. Had to have these special screws. Normally 100 of them would be $21, right? $21, remember that. I had just previously this opened up a professional account with this company, and I was telling my wife Lisa, I said, hey, with this professional account, I get a great discount. This is going to be fabulous. So I've got accounts with a lot of other places, AutoZone, John Deere Tractor, and other things. And I said, it's good to have this. I then bought 200 screws, and the gal told me, here's your bill. It's $1.53. I told my wife as we were driving off, I mean, that's a discount, right? That's fantastic. However, when I got home from Caldwell and went to put the receipt into the tax folder, I saw I was only charged for 20 screws. So how do we live a Christian life? Woohoo! Suckers! Free money! That's what Satan's telling me, right? That's what my heart's kind of telling me. But no, we called them up, told them what happened, and we paid the correct amount. Now, believe it or not, the same thing happened to my wife at Hobby Lobby the week before. Satan wants us to justify. It's their mistake. Think of it, God just blessed you with a great discount. Is that Christian living? Do we live that way when nobody's looking? God and Satan see us. Do right, people, because it's the right thing to do in God's eyes, not because somebody might be watching. Do we betray Christ when we're proud or haughty? Do you stop to realize that every single thing we have comes directly from God? Your physical belongings that you have, you couldn't have earned without God's blessing you with a good job, the talent to make money, an inheritance to buy these things. Is your health or athletic ability better than somebody else's? Don't be proud, because it can disappear just like this. Just like this. I think a lot of us have forgotten what it's like to live a godly Christian life. We're Sunday Christians. Hal, you know Hal, our friendly greeter, tall, handsome guy in the back? He told me last Sunday that a woman he was talking with said, and I quote, "I can play Christian." Is that how we want to be known? When we go home, do we treat our family like the enemy, not as the blessing that God has given us? But David, you say, you do not have to live with my family. Even you wouldn't love them. Remember, love's not a feeling. It's an act of your will. Jesus did not die on the cross because it was fun. He did it as an act of love for us and obedience to God. We have to bring our bodies and mind into conformance with the walk God wants us to do as Christian examples. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:27, "But I discipline my body daily and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." If you take nothing else away from this, remember that the Bible tells us again and again and again, and I quote, "Do justice, show mercy, and walk humbly before your God." Do not betray Christ in your daily life.